The story of ancient Arabia before Islam unfolds across thousands of years, beneath skies that have watched empires rise from sand and return to it. This is a land older than the names we know it by. Long before the faiths that would reshape the world, Arabia held its own civilizations, its own gods, its own memory. Tonight we walk through that older world, through kingdoms carved into red cliffs, through trade routes that connected 3 continents, through temples where frankincense smoke rose to deities whose names have mostly faded, through the lives of people who knew this peninsula as home long before history turned its full attention their way. The story begins not with cities or kings, but with the land itself. Arabia is a place that exists in layers. The surface layer, the one most visible, is sand and stone. But beneath that lies water, ancient water, trapped in aquifers since wetter ages. Beneath that, rock formations that speak of seas that covered this land hundreds of millions of years ago. Limestone, sandstone, granite. The bones of the earth, exposed and weathered by wind that has blown for eons. The peninsula is old in a way that makes human history feel recent. The rocks remember when this was ocean floor, when dinosaurs walked shores that no longer exist, when the continents themselves were arranged differently. The Red Sea is still opening, pulling Africa and Arabia apart, millimeter by millimeter each year. The land is not static. It moves. It changes. But so slowly that human lives cannot perceive it. The Arabian Peninsula stretches across nearly 2 million square miles. It is a vast triangle of stone and sand, bounded by water on 3 sides. The Red Sea runs along its western edge. The Arabian Gulf curves around the east. The Indian Ocean marks the southern coast. And to the north, the peninsula opens into the great Syrian desert, where Arabia blends into the ancient Near East without clear border. This geography shaped everything that followed. The interior is dominated by vast deserts. The Rub al-Khali, the empty quarter, spreads across the south. It is one of the largest sand deserts on Earth, covering an area larger than France. In some places, the sand dunes rise 300 meters high, waves of silicon frozen in their march across the land. The sand itself varies in color, red in some regions from iron oxide, white in others, golden. The color depends on the underlying rock, ground down over millennia into grains finer than salt. The Nafud Desert occupies the north. Its sands are distinctly red, stained by the sandstone from which they came. Between the Nafud and the Rub al-Khali, the Dana forms a corridor of red sand, a narrow desert connecting the 2 larger ones. These 3 deserts make up the majority of Arabia's interior. Between them lie areas of gravel plain called Hamada, where the wind has blown away all sand, leaving only stones. And there are areas of exposed rock, mountains, and plateaus where nothing grows, where the land is naked stone under endless sky. These deserts made the interior harsh, isolated, and strangely protective. No empire could easily conquer them. No army could march through without local knowledge. The desert was a barrier and a refuge. Those who knew it could move through it. Those who did not would die trying. But Arabia is not only desert. Along the western edge, mountains rise. The Hijaz range runs parallel to the Red Sea, a spine of volcanic rock. Some peaks reach over 2,000 meters. The mountains catch what moisture comes from the sea, creating slightly more rainfall than the interior receives. Valleys in the Hijaz, wadis that run with water during brief rainy seasons, allowed for oases. Settlements formed where water was reliable. The Asir Mountains in the southwest reach higher still, catching monsoon rains that green the valleys. Here the landscape transforms. Juniper trees cling to slopes. Terraced fields climb the mountainsides. Fog rolls through passes in the morning. This is Arabia Felix, the fortunate Arabia, as the Romans called it. The Yemen highlands, where agriculture was possible without extensive irrigation. where rain fell predictably enough to support permanent settlements and eventually cities. In the south, in what was once called Arabia Felix, the land softens further. Yemen and Oman knew water in ways the interior did not. In Yemen, seasonal monsoons brought rain, not the deluge of India, but enough. Rivers ran, at least during parts of the year. Some flowed year-round in ancient times, fed by higher water tables and more consistent rainfall patterns. The Wadi Hadhramaut cut a valley through the eastern desert, a ribbon of green in an otherwise brown land. Towns grew along its length, sustained by wells and seasonal floods. Oman faced the Indian Ocean. Its coast caught the edge of the monsoon system. The Dhofar region in southern Oman was green during the monsoon months. Here grew the frankincense trees, Boswellia sacra, adapted to this precise climate. Not too wet, not too dry. The trees needed the seasonal rain, but also needed the long, dry season. They grew nowhere else with the same abundance and quality. The coast itself varied dramatically. The Red Sea coast was harsh, with few natural harbors. The heat was extreme. Coral reefs made navigation dangerous. But there were ports. Jeddah would become important later, but in ancient times, smaller ports facilitated trade with Egypt and the Mediterranean beyond. The Gulf Coast was gentler, the water was shallower. Pearl diving was practiced here, a dangerous profession that brought wealth to coastal communities. Divers would descend without equipment, holding their breath, sometimes to depths of 30 meters. They searched the seabed for oysters, hoping to find pearls within. Many died doing this, drowned or killed by sharks or damaged by the pressure. But pearls commanded high prices, and poverty pushed men into the water. The southern coast, facing the Indian Ocean, had better harbors. Aden became one of the great ports of the ancient world. A natural harbor protected from storms, perfectly positioned to catch ships traveling between India and the Red Sea. Qana, further east, was another major port. From here, ships sailed to India with the southwest monsoon and returned months later with the northeast monsoon. The wind was the engine of maritime trade. Without steamships, without engines, sailors waited for the wind to turn. They planned their lives around these seasonal shifts. Months at sea, months in port. The monsoon cycle dictated everything. This was the stage, a peninsula of extremes, deserts that could kill in days, mountains that caught rain, coasts that connected to the world beyond, and in the gaps between extremes, in the oases and valleys, human communities took root, and the first people to walk it left almost no written record. The earliest evidence of human presence in Arabia reaches back tens of thousands of years. Stone tools have been found scattered across the peninsula, some dating to the lower Paleolithic, over 300,000 years ago. These are simple tools, hand axes, scrapers, worked flakes of flint and obsidian. They are the traces of hunter-gatherers who moved through landscapes that looked nothing like the Arabia we know. During wetter periods in prehistory, the peninsula held lakes, rivers, and grasslands. These wet phases, called pluvials, occurred multiple times during the Pleistocene epoch. During the last major wet phase, roughly between 130,000 and 75,000 years ago, and again around 10,000 years ago, Arabia was transformed. What are now sand deserts were then savannas. Grass grew, trees provided shade. Animals migrated across the peninsula in great herds. Archaeological sites reveal the bones of animals now extinct in the region or entirely gone from Earth. Hippos wallowed in rivers that no longer flow. Water buffalo grazed in meadows now buried under dunes. Elephants moved through woodlands. Oryx and gazelle were abundant. Lions hunted. Cheetahs ran. The fauna was more like East Africa than the Arabia we know, and humans hunted all of these animals. The people who hunted them followed the water. They lived in temporary camps near rivers and lakes. They made tools from the stone available locally. In some regions, obsidian was available, volcanic glass that flakes into edges sharper than steel. In other areas, they used flint, or chert. The stone tools found across Arabia are not unique to the peninsula. They show connections to tools found in Africa and the Levant, evidence that human populations moved freely across regions that are now separated by desert and sea. Around 70,000 years ago, during one of these wet periods, humans may have crossed from Africa into Arabia and from there spread to the rest of the world. This is one theory of human migration, that Arabia, when green, served as a corridor, a bridge, between Africa and Asia. The evidence is fragmentary. Stone tools, a few fossil remains, genetic data from modern populations that hints at ancient movements. The picture is incomplete, but Arabia's role in human prehistory may be more central than once thought. As the climate dried, life became harder. The last major wet phase ended around 6,000 years ago. The lakes dried, the rivers shrank, then vanished. The grasslands turned to scrub, then to sand. The great herds moved away or died out, and the people adapted. Some moved toward the coasts, others congregated around the few water sources that remained. The interior became harder to inhabit, but never impossible. The transition from hunting and gathering to pastoralism happened gradually. At some sites in eastern Arabia, archaeologists have found evidence of cattle herding dating back 7,000 years. Cattle need water and grazing. They indicate that the climate was still slightly wetter than today, or that herders were using areas near springs and seasonal streams. Over time, as conditions dried further, cattle became less viable. Sheep and goats, which need less water and can browse on tougher vegetation, became the dominant livestock. And then came the camel. The domestication of the dromedary, the one-humped Arabian camel, changed everything. When this happened is debated. The earliest evidence of domesticated camels in Arabia dates to around 3,000 years ago, though some scholars argue it could be earlier. Camels are adapted to arid conditions in ways cattle could never be. They can survive for weeks without water. They can eat plants that are toxic or indigestible to other animals. They can carry heavy loads across terrain no wheeled vehicle could manage. They provide milk, meat, leather, and hair. The camel made deep desert life possible. It opened the interior to movement and trade on a scale that transformed Arabia. By the 4th millennium before the Common Era, Arabia was connected to the broader ancient world through trade. The coasts had always looked outward. The people of the eastern shore traded across the Gulf with Mesopotamia, with the Sumerian cities that rose in the river valleys. They sent shells, pearls, and copper. They received grain, textiles, and manufactured goods. The western shore sent goods up the Red Sea toward Egypt, toward the pharaohs who were building pyramids and temples that still stand. The southern ports faced the Indian Ocean, where monsoon winds carried ships to India and East Africa, connecting Arabia to trade networks that spanned the ancient world. And Arabia had something the ancient world wanted desperately: incense, frankincense, and myrrh. These resins came from trees that grew in the mountains of southern Arabia and the Horn of Africa, in Somalia and northern Ethiopia. The trees themselves are unremarkable to look at. Small, twisted, growing from rocky soil in places where little else survives. But when their bark is cut, they weep a sap that hardens into translucent lumps. This resin, when burned, produces smoke that is sweet, complex, and sacred. The smell is difficult to describe to those who have not experienced it. It is not simply pleasant, it is penetrating, woody but also citrusy, earthy but also elevated. The smoke rises in thick columns, filling spaces with a scent that lingers for hours. In the ancient world, this smoke was the smell of the divine. It was how humans communicated with gods. It was the medium between earth and heaven. Every temple in the ancient world burned incense. Egyptian priests burned it daily in offerings to Ra, to Osiris, to Isis. In Jerusalem, the temple burned incense on golden altars. In Greece, frankincense was offered to Apollo, to Zeus. In Rome, every significant ritual required it. Births, deaths, marriages, victories. The censers swung, the smoke rose. The prayers were carried upward on fragrant clouds. Kings used it. Pharaohs were buried with it. The tomb of Tutankhamun contained jars of frankincense, meant to perfume his journey to the afterlife. Roman emperors burned quantities that seem extravagant. Nero reportedly burned a year's supply of frankincense at his wife's funeral, a gesture of either grief or spectacle, depending on who tells the story. The wealthy burned it in their homes, not just for the gods, but for themselves, to mask the smells of urban life, to display wealth, to create an atmosphere of luxury and refinement. The demand was enormous, and for thousands of years, southern Arabia controlled much of the supply. The Egyptians sent expeditions down the Red Sea to obtain it directly, but these were expensive and dangerous. Most incense came through intermediaries, through Arab traders who controlled the sources and the routes. This gave those traders immense power. They could set prices. They could withhold supply. They were the gatekeepers to the sacred. The frankincense tree, Boswellia sacra, grows slowly in rocky soil. It is not cultivated so much as harvested from wild trees that grow in specific microclimates. The resin is harvested by cutting the bark and letting the sap harden. The first harvest each year produces the lowest quality resin, darker and less aromatic. This is scraped away. The second and third harvests, weeks apart, produce progressively purer resin. The finest frankincense is pale, almost translucent, with a strong, clean scent. This was what kings and temples wanted. This commanded the highest prices. Myrrh comes from a related tree, Commiphora myrrha. It grows in similar regions but produces a different resin. Myrrh is darker, more bitter in scent. It was used in medicine as well as ritual. It had antiseptic properties. It could be dissolved in wine and used as an anesthetic. It was mixed into ointments for wounds. It was used in embalming. The Egyptians imported vast quantities for mummification, packing the body cavities with myrrh-soaked linen to preserve the flesh and perfume. The tomb. Both resins, once dried, could be transported vast distances without spoiling. They were light relative to their value. They were non-perishable. They were perfect for long-distance trade. A camel could carry a year's wages in incense. The weight was manageable. The profit margins were extraordinary. This is what built kingdoms in southern Arabia. By the late second millennium, the incense trade had created wealth in southern Arabia. That wealth built kingdoms. The first of these kingdoms emerged in what is now Yemen. The Sabaeans appeared in written records around the 10th century, before the Common Era, though they were likely established earlier. Their capital was Marib. It sat in a valley where water could be controlled, where the seasonal floods that poured from the mountains could be captured and used rather than simply endured. The Sabaeans built a great dam there, one of the engineering achievements of the ancient world. The Marib Dam was not a single structure, but a system. Two massive earthen walls, faced with stone, channeled the floodwaters into canals. The main dam stretched over 600 meters. The walls were thick, capable of withstanding the force of seasonal floods that could turn a dry wadi into a raging torrent within hours. The engineering was sophisticated. Spillways released excess water. Sluice gates controlled flow. The system distributed water through a network of canals to irrigate fields miles from the dam itself. This allowed agriculture on a scale rare in Arabia. Fields of grain, barley, and wheat spread across the valley. Date palms grew in groves. Vegetables were cultivated. The population grew. Marib became a city of tens of thousands, sustained by engineered abundance in a land otherwise scarce. The dam required constant maintenance. Stone needed replacement. Sediment needed removal. Gates needed repair. This maintenance required organization, labor, and taxation. In maintaining the dam, the Sabaeans maintained their state. The dam was not just infrastructure, It was the physical manifestation of centralized power. The kingdom of Saba was wealthy beyond the agricultural surplus. The incense trade flowed through Sabaean territory. Caravans formed in Marib and other Sabaean cities, carrying frankincense north. The kingdom taxed this trade, protected it, profited from it. The wealth funded building projects. Temples rose in Marib, in Sirwa, in other Sabaean towns. These were not small structures. They were monumental, built of limestone blocks, some weighing tons. The blocks were cut precisely, fitted without mortar in some cases. The craftsmanship was high. The aesthetic was austere but impressive. The temple of Awam, dedicated to the moon god Almaka, was the most important religious site in Saba. It stood outside Marib in a sacred precinct. The temple was oval in plan, unusual for the region, with an outer wall enclosing a colonnade. Inside, a sacred area held the altar where sacrifices were made. Bronze plaques lined the walls, inscribed with dedications from worshippers. Statues stood in niches, representing gods or perhaps notable individuals. The temple accumulated offerings over centuries: gold, silver, bronze, carnelian, alabaster, objects dedicated to the god in thanks for favors or in hopes of blessings to come. The Sabaeans wrote in an old South Arabian script, using letters that looked nothing like the Arabic alphabet that would come later. The script is called Musnad. It consists of 29 consonants, written right to left, without vowels. The letters are angular, elegant in a geometric way. They were carved into stone, cast into bronze, written on palm leaves. The inscriptions record building dedications, military victories, legal decisions, and offerings to gods. They are the voice of the Sabaeans, speaking across millennia in a language scholars can now read, but which no living person speaks. The language itself was Semitic, related to Hebrew, Aramaic, and Arabic, but distinctly its own. Words can be reconstructed, meanings inferred, but the sound of the language, the accent and rhythm, is lost. No recordings exist. No native speakers survived. We have the written form, a skeleton of language, but not the living speech. The Sabaeans built in stone, which is why their monuments survived. Temples, city walls, houses for the wealthy. Stone resists time better than mud brick, though even stone weathers. The inscriptions fade, the details blur, but enough remains to reconstruct the outlines of their world. Their temples were rectangular, open to the sky, with altars where animals were sacrificed and incense burned. The gods they honored were many, but Almaka was primary. He was a lunar deity associated with irrigation and fertility. The moon was central to Sabaean cosmology. Its phases marked time, its light guided travelers. In a desert land where the sun burned without mercy, the moon was gentler. It illuminated without scorching. It waxed and waned, a cycle that paralleled the agricultural cycle. Planting, growing, harvesting, fallow. The moon's phases were a calendar written in the sky, visible to all. Other gods included Athtar, associated with Venus, the morning and evening star; Halbus and Hall, deities of the Central Highlands; Wad, a deity associated with love, or perhaps snakes. The exact attributes are often unclear. The inscriptions mention gods, but rarely describe them in detail. They were known to the people who wrote the inscriptions. Explanation was unnecessary. For us, reading millennia later, the gods are names and associations, fragments of a religion practiced by millions, but no longer understood in its fullness. Saba was not alone. Other kingdoms rose in southern Arabia, each controlling territories, each participating in the incense economy, each building their own cities and temples. These kingdoms competed, allied, and fought. They shared a similar culture, similar gods, and similar wealth, drawn from the incense trade and from agriculture sustained by sophisticated water management. The Manaeans controlled trade routes to the north of Saba. Their kingdom, Ma'in, was smaller but strategically positioned. The capital, Karnau, sat in the Joff Valley, an area of relative fertility. The Minaeans were merchants as much as rulers. They established trading colonies far from their homeland, in the northern Hijaz, in the oases along the incense route. These colonies were not military outposts, but commercial settlements. Minaean merchants lived in foreign cities, managing caravans, negotiating with local tribes, sending profits back to Karnak. Inscriptions in Minaean script have been found as far north as Al-Ula near Madain Saleh, evidence of their reach. The Minaean kingdom was prosperous from the 5th to the 1st centuries before the Common Era. They minted coins, unusual for southern Arabia at that time. The coins were small, silver, stamped with monograms and symbols. They facilitated trade in ways barter could not. A merchant could carry wealth in a pouch rather than in goods. Transactions became more fluid. The Minaeans understood commerce in ways that were sophisticated for their era and place. The Qatabanians held territory to the east and south of Saba. Their capital, Timna, was a walled city in the highlands. The walls were massive, built of stone blocks enclosing temples, palaces, and residential areas. The Qatabanian kingdom lasted from roughly the 5th century before the Common Era into the early centuries of the Common Era. They were agriculturalists and traders, controlling valleys where water was reliable, where terraced fields climbed the slopes. The Qatabanians worshipped Am, a moon god similar to Almaka, but distinct. The theology of these kingdoms was related, but not identical. Each had its own pantheon, its own rituals, its own sacred sites. The gods were tied to place. Am was the god of Qataban, not of Saba. A traveler moving between kingdoms would encounter different shrines, different priests, different rituals. The religious landscape was as fragmented as the political one. The Hadhramites governed the eastern valleys, the Wadi Hadhramaut and its tributaries. This region was more isolated, protected by distance and by the desert that surrounded it. The Hadhramites built cities along the wadi. Shabwa was their capital, a center of trade and governance. The Hadhramaut was known for producing high-quality incense. The frankincense from this region was particularly valued. It commanded premium prices in distant markets. The Hadhramites also produced myrrh, and they exported both resins through the port of Qana on the southern coast. From Qana, ships sailed to India and East Africa. The Hadhramites were part of a maritime network as well as the overland incense route. This dual access to trade routes gave them economic resilience. When overland trade declined, maritime trade could compensate, and vice versa. These kingdoms were not static. Borders shifted, alliances formed and broke, wars were fought, usually over control of water sources or trade routes. The inscriptions record battles, victories, defeats. Kings boast of subduing enemies, of capturing cities, of extending their territory. But the details are often vague. Specific battles are hard to reconstruct. The inscriptions were propaganda as much as history. They emphasized the king's power, the god's favor, the kingdom's prosperity. They were not meant as objective records, but as assertions of legitimacy and strength. Despite the conflicts, there was also cultural unity. The South Arabian kingdoms shared artistic styles. Their sculpture, particularly in alabaster, followed similar conventions. Seated figures with large, staring eyes. Stylized features. Inscriptions on the base or back dedicating the statue to a god. These statues were placed in temples as permanent worshippers, standing in for the donor, offering prayers on their behalf in perpetuity. The concept is similar to votive statues in other ancient cultures, but the South Arabian style is distinct, immediately recognizable. Architecture also showed common elements. Temples were usually rectangular with outer walls and inner sanctuaries. Columns were common, supporting roofs or marking sacred boundaries. The capitals of columns were often decorated with ibex heads or geometric patterns. Ibexes, wild goats adapted to rocky terrain, were common in the highlands. They appeared frequently in art, perhaps because of their agility and resilience, qualities valued in a harsh land. The kingdoms also shared a script and related languages, making communication possible across political boundaries. Merchants from Qataban could negotiate with Sabaean officials. Treaties could be written and understood. The linguistic unity, even amidst political fragmentation, facilitated trade and cultural exchange. That trade moved overland. Caravans carried frankincense and myrrh from the southern kingdoms northward through the interior of the peninsula toward the Mediterranean world. The routes followed oases and wells. They skirted the worst of the deserts. They moved slowly, with hundreds of camels, protected by tribal agreements and payments. The journey from southern Arabia to Gaza or Damascus could take months. Every kingdom and tribe along the route took a share. This created a network of dependency and wealth that reached across Arabia. The incense trade became the economic spine of the peninsula for over 1,000 years. In the northwest, another kingdom would rise from this trade. The Nabataeans appeared in history around the 4th century before the Common Era. They were originally a nomadic Arab tribe, but they settled and built one of the most remarkable civilizations in Arabia. Their capital was Petra, carved into the rose-red cliffs of what is now southern Jordan. Petra sat at a crossroads. Incense caravans from the south passed through. Trade. Routes from the Arabian Gulf met routes from the Red Sea. The Nabataeans controlled the water sources. They controlled the passes. They grew rich. Petra itself is hard to describe without lapsing into wonder, but the facts alone carry weight. The city was hidden in a narrow canyon, accessible only through a long, winding gorge called the Siq. The walls of the Siq rise hundreds of feet. The path is cool and shadowed. At the end, the canyon opens onto the treasury, a temple facade carved directly from the cliff. Columns, pediments, and statues, all cut from living rock. It still stands. The stone glows pink and orange in certain light, but Petra was more than monuments. It was a functioning city. The Nabataeans were master hydraulic engineers. They carved channels into the rock to capture every drop of rain. They built cisterns, dams, and pipes. They controlled water in a way that made permanent settlement possible in an arid landscape. This knowledge, as much as their military skill or trade wealth, was their power. The Nabataeans were Arab, but they engaged deeply with the Hellenistic world. After Alexander the Great's conquests, Greek culture spread across the Near East. The Nabataeans adopted Greek artistic styles, built Greek-style theaters, and used Greek in their inscriptions alongside Aramaic and early Arabic scripts. Their culture was syncretic, blending traditions. Their religion honored Arabian gods, but the temples sometimes followed Greek architectural forms. Their chief deity was Dushara, a god associated with mountains and storms. He was often represented not by statues, but by sacred stones, blocks of rock uncarved, standing in sanctuaries. This tradition of sacred stones as divine symbols was widespread in pre-Islamic Arabia. The gods were present in the stone itself, not merely represented by it. The Nabataeans thrived for centuries. They expanded their territory. They negotiated with Rome. They maintained independence even as the Roman Empire absorbed much of the Near East. But in the year 106 of the Common Era, Rome annexed the Nabataean kingdom, turning it into the province of Arabia Petraea. Petra continued as a city, but its political power ended. The trade routes gradually shifted. Petra slowly emptied. The carved facades remained, silent and inhabited only by wind. While kingdoms rose and fell in the south and northwest, the interior of Arabia followed a different rhythm entirely. The Bedouin were the people of the desert. They were not a single tribe, but a way of life, a set of adaptations to one of Earth's harshest environments. Nomadic pastoralists who moved with their herds of camels, goats, and sheep, following the sparse and unpredictable patterns of rainfall and vegetation. They knew the desert as no settled people could. They knew where water lay beneath the sand, recognizing subtle changes in vegetation or rock formations that indicated underground aquifers. They knew the stars that guided at night, not just the major constellations, but individual stars whose rising and setting marked specific times and directions. They knew which plants could sustain animals during drought, which had medicinal properties, which were poisonous. They lived in tents woven from goat hair, structures that could be dismantled and moved in hours, leaving almost no trace. The tent itself was an engineering solution to nomadic life. Black goat hair was woven into long strips, which were sewn together to create panels. When wet, the hair swelled, making the tent waterproof. When dry, tiny gaps between the fibers allowed air circulation, keeping the interior cooler than it would otherwise be. The tent was supported by poles, usually 3 main poles with shorter poles around the edges. Guy ropes secured it against wind. The interior was divided by curtains, creating separate spaces for men and women, for receiving guests, and for family privacy. Inside the tent, belongings were minimal. Rugs or mats covered the sand. Cushions provided seating. Cooking equipment consisted of a few pots, a coffee roaster, and a mortar for grinding coffee beans or grain. Water was stored in leather skins hung from the tent poles, where evaporation through the leather cooled the water slightly. Food was stored in bags or baskets, weapons hung from the poles, ready to hand. Everything had its place. Everything could be packed quickly. The camel made this life possible. The Arabian camel, the dromedary, is a creature adapted to extremes in ways that seem almost designed for desert life. Its hump stores fat, not water as commonly believed, but fat that can be metabolized into energy and water when food is scarce. It can survive weeks without drinking. When it does drink, it can consume over 30 gallons in minutes, rehydrating completely. Its blood cells are oval rather than round, allowing blood to flow even when the camel is dehydrated. Its kidneys are extremely efficient, producing concentrated urine to conserve water. Its body temperature fluctuates, rising during the day to avoid sweating, cooling at night. It can eat thorny plants that would injure other animals thanks to tough mouth tissues. Its feet are broad and padded, spreading its weight on sand. Beyond transportation, the camel provides milk, which was the primary source of nutrition for many Bedouin. Camel milk is richer in vitamin C than cow milk, important in a diet with little fresh vegetation. It has less fat, but more minerals. It can be drunk fresh or left to sour into a kind of yogurt. During times of plenty, camels produced enough milk to sustain a family. During drought, the milk production dropped, but even a small amount was valuable. Camel meat was eaten, though usually only when an animal died naturally or had to be slaughtered for a special occasion. A healthy camel was too valuable to kill casually. But at weddings, or when honoring an important guest, a camel might be slaughtered. The meat was roasted or boiled and shared among many people. Waste was unthinkable. Every part of the animal was used. The hide became leather. The bones became tools. The sinews became cordage. Even the dung, dried, provided fuel for fires in a landscape with little wood. Bedouin society was organized by kinship, traced through the male line. The tribe, Qawm, was the fundamental unit. It provided identity, protection, and obligation. A person without a tribe was vulnerable, unprotected by the law of blood revenge that regulated violence. If a tribal member was killed, the tribe was obligated to seek justice, either through blood money or through retaliatory killing. This system, while brutal, created a form of deterrence. Attacking a member of a powerful tribe meant risking conflict with the entire tribe. The calculus usually favored restraint. Within the tribe, the sheikh was the leader, but his power was limited. He led through consensus and reputation, not through absolute authority. Important decisions were made in council, with elder men debating and voting. The sheikh could propose action, but if the tribe disagreed, he could not compel obedience. This was not democracy in any modern sense, but neither was it autocracy. It was a system that valued the voice of experienced men and required leaders to maintain support through wisdom and generosity. Generosity was a central virtue, perhaps the central virtue. A sheikh was expected to be generous, hosting guests, providing for the poor within the tribe, giving freely from his wealth. A wealthy man who hoarded was despised. A poor man who shared his last handful of dates was praised. The harsh environment made mutual aid essential. Today's host might be tomorrow's guest. Today's wealthy man might be tomorrow's refugee, his herds lost to drought or raid. Maintaining a reputation for generosity was insurance as much as morality. Hospitality extended even to strangers. A traveler who approached a tent could expect food and shelter for 3 days, no questions asked. After 3 days, the host could inquire about the guest's business, but before that, the traveler was under protection. This custom made travel through tribal territories possible. Without it, the desert would have been impassable for anyone not part of local tribes. The custom was not altruistic in origin, but practical. It created a network of mutual obligation that benefited everyone. The Bedouin were poets, and poetry was the highest art, valued above all other forms of expression. A great poet brought honor to his tribe. His verses praising the tribe's courage or his sheikh's generosity enhanced their reputation. Conversely, a satirical poem mocking a rival could damage their standing more effectively than a raid. Poetry was weapon and tool and art all at once. The poems were oral, memorized, and performed. Meter and rhyme aided memorization. The poems followed complex metrical patterns, 16 different meters traditionally recognized, each with its own rhythm and feel. The language was elevated, using archaic words and phrases not found in everyday speech. Metaphors were conventional. The beloved was compared to a gazelle, the warrior to a lion, the generous man to rain clouds bringing life to the desert. But within these conventions, individual voices emerged. Imru al-Qais, whose opening lines describing an abandoned campsite became iconic, influencing poets for centuries. Tarafa ibn al-Abd, who wrote of his love for life and pleasure, defying the asceticism some praised. Zuhair ibn Abi Sulma, whose poem celebrating peace between tribes is both beautiful and politically astute. These poets were remembered, their words were treasured, and they shaped the Arabic language itself, establishing standards of eloquence that later writers would emulate. Poetry competitions were held at seasonal fairs, gatherings where tribes came together to trade, to settle disputes, and to celebrate shared culture. The most famous was the Ukaz Fair, held annually in the valley of Ukaz, near Taif. For several weeks each year, the tribes gathered. Warfare was suspended. Merchants set up stalls. Judges heard cases, and poets competed. The competition was serious. Poets would recite their newest compositions. The audience, consisting of other poets and educated listeners, would judge. The best poems were praised and memorized. The inferior were mocked. Reputation was made or lost in these performances. A poet who impressed at Ukaz could travel across Arabia with his fame preceding him, receiving hospitality and gifts from sheikhs who wanted his praise. 7 poems, known as the Mu'allaqat, were said to be the finest of these competition poems. The name means the suspended ones, and tradition claimed they were hung on the Kaaba in Mecca, though this claim is disputed by scholars. Whether they hung or not, they were considered the pinnacle of pre-Islamic Arabic poetry. They were memorized in their entirety, passed down through generations, and eventually written down after Islam. They survive today, still read, still studied, still considered masterpieces of Arabic literature. The Bedouin were not isolated. They interacted constantly with settled peoples. They traded with oasis towns. They hired out as guards for caravans. They raided, which was not considered crime, but a form of economic redistribution and assertion of tribal strength. Raids followed rules. They targeted livestock and goods, not lives when possible. A successful raid brought prestige. A poorly planned one brought shame and retribution. Between the nomads and the kingdoms, there were the oases. An oasis is a place where water reaches the surface in a land otherwise dry. A spring, a well, a place where date palms can grow. Oases were the anchor points of Arabian life. They were places of rest for caravans, markets where nomads traded with merchants, sites where tribes met to settle disputes or arrange marriages. And sometimes they grew into towns. One of the oldest and most important oases was Yathrib, later known as Medina. It sat in the Hijaz, the western region, along the incense route. The oasis was fertile. Date palms grew thick. Wells provided reliable water. Tribes settled there. Agriculture was possible. Over time, Yathrib became a complex community, with farmers, traders, craftsmen, and by the early centuries of the Common Era, a significant Jewish population. How Jews came to Arabia is a question with many answers. Some may have migrated after the destruction of the Temple in Jerusalem. Others may have been there longer, part of ancient Semitic migrations. They were Arabs in culture, speaking Arabic, but Jewish in religion. They lived alongside polytheist Arabs, sharing the oasis economy. Further south, along the Hijaz, lay another oasis, Mecca. It was smaller than Yathrib and less agriculturally rich. But it had something else. It was a sanctuary, a sacred space recognized across tribal lines. The center of this sanctuary was a shrine, a simple structure of stone called the Kaaba. Inside the Kaaba, or arranged around it, were stones and idols representing many gods: Hubal, Alat, Al-Uzza, Manat, Wad, Suwa, Yaguth. Different tribes honored different deities, but the Kaaba was a shared sacred space. Mecca's sacredness brought a truce. Tribal warfare was forbidden within the sanctuary boundaries during sacred months. This made Mecca a safe place to trade. Over time, it became a commercial center as well as a religious one. The tribe that controlled Mecca, the Quraysh, grew wealthy managing pilgrimage and commerce. They were merchants, not warriors, but they held power through economic control and religious prestige. The gods of pre-Islamic Arabia were many, as varied as the tribes and regions of the peninsula. Each tribe had its own deities, its own sacred stones and groves. But certain gods were widely recognized, their worship spreading beyond single tribes to become regional or even pan-Arabian. Al-Lat was a goddess worshipped across the peninsula, but her primary temple stood in Taif, a mountain town southeast of Mecca. The name Al-Lat may derive from a word meaning the goddess, suggesting she was once simply the deity before other gods proliferated. She was associated with the sky, with fertility, with the earth's abundance. Her shrine at Taif was a large structure enclosed by walls, with a sacred stone at its center. Worshippers would circumambulate the stone, walking around it in circles, a ritual that predated Islam and would later be incorporated into Islamic pilgrimage, though directed toward the Kaaba instead. Sacrifices were made to Alat. Animals, usually sheep or goats, were slaughtered, and their blood poured on or near the sacred stone. The meat was then distributed among the worshippers and the poor, making the sacrifice both a religious act and a communal meal. This pattern of sacrifice followed by shared eating was common across Arabian religion. The gods received the blood and perhaps the smoke of burnt portions. Humans received the nourishment and the social bonding that came from eating together. Al-Uzza was another goddess, often associated with the planet Venus, the morning and evening star. Her worship was particularly strong among the Quraysh, the tribe that controlled Mecca. Al-Uzza had a shrine in the valley of Nakhla, between Mecca and Taif. 3 acacia trees were sacred to her, and a stone stood between them. Priests served her shrine, managing offerings and performing rituals on behalf of worshippers. The shrine accumulated wealth over generations as pilgrims brought gifts and the priests managed the assets. Manat was a goddess of fate and fortune, her name related to the Arabic word for destiny. Her shrine stood on the coast between Mecca and Medina at a place called Qudayd. She was particularly honored by two tribes, the Arabus and the Khazraj, who lived in the Medina oasis. Pilgrims would shave their heads at her shrine as a sign of devotion and the completion of vows. The hair was left at the shrine, a physical offering representing the pilgrim's dedication. These three goddesses, Allat, Al-Uzza, and Manat, are sometimes called the daughters of Allah in pre-Islamic sources. The name Allah, meaning the god, was known and used in pre-Islamic Arabia. It appears in poetry and inscriptions. The relationship between Allah and the other gods is unclear and probably varied by region and time. In some contexts, Allah seems to have been regarded as a high god, perhaps a creator deity above the more immediate tribal gods. In other contexts, he seems to be one god among many. The theology was not systematic. It varied by tribe and by individual belief. Hubal was the primary god housed inside the Kaaba in Mecca. He was represented by a carnelian idol, a human figure, brought to Mecca from the Nabataean territories according to tradition. Hubal was a god of divination. Arrows were cast before his idol to determine answers to questions. 7 arrows, each marked with a different outcome, were drawn from a quiver. The arrow drawn provided the god's answer. This practice, called istiqsam, was common at the Kaaba. People came seeking guidance on marriages, business ventures, disputes. They paid the priests, cast the arrows, and received Hubal's verdict. Wad was a god associated with love, or possibly with snakes, though the exact symbolism is unclear. His worship was particularly strong in northern Arabia, among tribes near the Syrian frontier. Images of Wad have been found, usually showing a standing male figure with a beard, sometimes holding objects that might be snakes or staffs. He had a temple in the town of Dumat al-Jandal, an important oasis on the northern trade routes. Suwa was a god whose cult was centered in the western highlands. Little is known about his attributes, though his name appears in inscriptions and is mentioned in later Islamic sources as one of the gods whose worship was ended with the coming of Islam. Yaguth was another deity, worshipped by the tribe of Madij in Yemen. Again, specific attributes are unclear. The god's name and the fact of his worship are known, but the rituals and theology have not survived in detail. This pattern repeats across dozens of gods, names preserved in stones or in later texts that describe pre-Islamic practices. But the living context, the prayers spoken, the myths told, the theological explanations, these are mostly lost. We have names and fragments. We know there were gods of rain, gods of war, gods of specific locations. We know that some gods were represented by carved idols, others by uncarved stones, the rock itself considered sacred, still others by trees or springs or features of landscape. Sacred stones called ansab or beetles were particularly important. These were natural stones or roughly worked stones set up at holy sites. They were not representations of gods in the sense that Greek or Roman statues were. They were manifestations or dwelling places of the divine. The god was in the stone, not depicted by it. Worshippers would anoint the stones with blood or oil. They would circumambulate them. They would touch them or kiss them, seeking blessing or establishing connection with the divine. Trees were also sacred. Certain ancient trees, particularly in areas where trees were rare, became objects of veneration. Rags would be tied to their branches as offerings or as physical prayers. Sick individuals might sleep under sacred trees, hoping for healing dreams. Women hoping for children might make vows at these trees, promising offerings if their prayers were granted. Springs were sacred because water itself was sacred in a dry land. A spring that never failed, that provided water year after year through droughts, was clearly blessed. Shrines were built near major springs. Rituals were performed to thank the gods for the water or to ensure its continuance. The afterlife was uncertain in pre-Islamic Arabian belief. Some inscriptions suggest belief in an afterlife where the dead continued in some diminished form. Other sources suggest skepticism or ambiguity. Poetry often reflects a stoic acceptance of mortality. Life is brief. Death comes to all. Fame and honor outlast the body, living in the memory of the tribe and in the verses of poets. This was the immortality most hoped for, not a personal continuation after death, but a continuation of name and reputation. The jinn were believed in universally. These were beings of smokeless fire, invisible but present, inhabiting wild places, ruins, and the deep desert. They could be benevolent or malevolent. Some jinn were neutral, simply coexisting with humans. Others were hostile, causing illness, madness, or mischief. Poets claimed that their best verses were inspired by jinn, supernatural muses who whispered words in the night. Certain locations were known to be inhabited by jinn and were avoided or approached with caution and ritual protection. Magic and divination were practiced. Seers, called kahin, claimed to receive messages from jinn or from the gods. They spoke in rhythmic, cryptic language, saj, that resembled poetry but was considered a distinct form. People consulted kahins for advice, for prophecies, for help in finding lost animals or identifying thieves. The kahins' authority rested on their reputation for accuracy and on the belief that they had access to hidden knowledge. This religious landscape, diverse and decentralized, had no single sacred text, no unified priesthood, no central authority. Each tribe followed its own practices, honored its own gods, maintained its own sacred sites. There was overlap and shared elements, particularly among neighboring tribes, but no orthodoxy. Religion was local and tribal, tied to specific places and specific communities. Yet Arabia was never completely isolated from the monotheistic traditions developing around it. Judaism had a presence, as mentioned, especially in the oases of the Hijaz. Christianity reached Arabia by the early centuries of the Common Era. It came from multiple directions, from the north through Syria, from the east through Mesopotamia, from the west across the Red Sea from Aksum in Ethiopia, which had converted to Christianity in the 4th century. Christian communities existed in southern Arabia, in Najran and other towns. Some Arab tribes, particularly those on the Byzantine frontier, converted. Inscriptions in Old South Arabian script sometimes invoke Jesus or the Christian God. The Himyarite kingdom, which came to dominate southern Arabia by the 4th century, converted to Judaism at some point, at least at the elite level. Later, Himyarite kings were Christian, or perhaps reverted to paganism. The religious landscape was shifting. The old certainties were weakening. The gods who had watched over the incense kingdoms for 1,000 years were facing new competitors. At the same time, Arabia's political landscape was changing. The great powers to the north, the Byzantine Empire and the Sasanian Persian Empire, were locked in centuries of conflict. Arabia lay between them, and both empires sought to control or influence the peninsula. They could not conquer the deserts, but they could cultivate allies, support proxy kingdoms, and disrupt each other's trade. The Byzantines allied with the Ghassanids, a Christian Arab tribal confederation based in the Syrian desert and the northern edges of Arabia. The Sasanians allied with the Lakhmids, another Arab confederation based near the Gulf, with their capital at Hira in southern Mesopotamia. Both of these Arab buffer states were powerful in their own right. They protected their imperial sponsors, raided each other, and absorbed the military and cultural influences of Rome and Persia. The Ghassanids adopted Byzantine Christianity and fought under Byzantine banners. The Lakhmids were often Nestorian Christians, less orthodox, and served as Persia's shield against Byzantine and Arab raids. These proxy wars rarely touched the deep interior, but they shaped the edges of Arabia. Trade routes were vulnerable, loyalty shifted, and Arabic culture was increasingly exposed to the great civilizations beyond the peninsula. In the south, the Himyarite kingdom faced its own pressures. In the early 6th century, the Himyarite king Du-Nuwas converted to Judaism or reinforced Jewish practices at court. According to Byzantine and Ethiopian sources, he persecuted the Christian community in Najran, executing many in the year 523. This event, known as the Massacre of Najran, provoked a response. The Christian kingdom of Aksum, across the Red Sea in Ethiopia, invaded southern Arabia in 525. They defeated Du-Nuwas, who reportedly rode his horse into the sea and drowned rather than surrender. The Aksumites installed a Christian governor and established control over Yemen. Aksumite rule did not last long. By mid-century, an Aksumite general named Abraha took control and ruled semi-independently. He built a great church in Sana'a, intending to redirect Arabian pilgrimage away from Mecca toward his Christian cathedral. In the year 570 or thereabouts, according to later tradition, Abraha led an army north toward Mecca. The army reportedly included a war elephant, a creature unknown in Arabia, which terrified the locals. The campaign failed. Whether through disease, logistical collapse, or resistance, Abraha's forces withdrew. He died shortly after. The same year, or near it, a child was born in Mecca. His name was Muhammad. His life would change everything. But his birth was still within the old world, the world this script walks through. The Arabia he was born into was the Arabia of many gods, many tribes, ancient trade routes, kingdoms fading, and foreign powers pressing in. That Arabia, the Arabia before Islam, was not primitive or backward. It was complex. It had produced kingdoms that lasted centuries, art and architecture of lasting beauty, poetry of profound skill, systems of law and honor that governed millions across vast spaces without central authority, trade networks that linked 3 continents, and a people who survived and thrived in one of the harshest environments on earth. Let us return to the incense trade, because it deserves a slower walk. The trade that built kingdoms, the trade that brought Greek merchants to southern Arabia and Arabian merchants to Rome, the trade that moved, over centuries, tons of resin from trees growing in remote mountains to temples and homes thousands of miles away. Imagine a caravan forming in Marib. It is early morning, before dawn. The sun has not yet risen over the mountains to the east. The air is cool, the only time of day when work is bearable during the hot season. Men are loading camels in the gray pre-dawn light. Each camel can carry between 300 and 500 pounds, depending on the animal's size and strength. The loads must be balanced carefully. Uneven weight will cause sores on the camel's back, making the animal useless for weeks. A lame camel in the middle of a desert is a crisis. The loads consist primarily of bags made from woven goat hair or leather. Inside are frankincense resin lumps, each piece carefully inspected. The quality determines the price. The pale, translucent pieces are packed separately from the darker, lower-grade resin. There are also bundles of myrrh, darker and more aromatic, packed in similar bags. Other goods accompany the incense: spices from India, brought by ship to southern Arabian ports; textiles, fine weaves that command high prices in the north; tortoiseshell from the coast, used for inlay work; pearls from the Gulf, brought overland to join the caravans. But incense is the heart of it, the most valuable cargo by weight, the reason the caravan exists. The caravan master checks the loads. He is an experienced man, middle-aged, his face weathered by sun and wind. He has made this journey many times, perhaps 20 or 30 trips over the course of his life. He knows every oasis, every well, every tribal territory between here and Gaza. He knows which tribes are trustworthy and which require careful negotiation. He knows where water is reliable and where it might fail. This knowledge cannot be written down adequately. It must be learned through experience, passed from master to apprentice over years. The camels are ready. 70 animals in this caravan. A large group, safer from raiders, but also slower to move and more demanding of water and pasture. 30 men accompany the caravan, drivers for the camels, guards armed with spears and swords. A few merchants traveling with their own goods, hiring the caravan for protection and navigation. The drivers mount their camels, settling into the saddles, which are simple wooden frames with padding. Not comfortable by any standard, but functional. The camels rise, first the back legs, pitching the rider forward, then the front legs leveling out. The motion takes getting used to. Experienced riders adjust without thought. Newcomers often feel sick for the first few days. The caravan moves out. The pace is walking speed, roughly 3 miles per hour. Camels can move faster, but not when loaded, and not for long periods. The journey will take 2 months, perhaps 3 if there are delays. They will cover over 1,200 miles, following a route that stays close to the western edge of Arabia, avoiding the deep desert, moving from oasis to oasis. Days pass in heat and monotony. The sun rises, quickly becoming unbearable. The landscape is stone and scrub. The Hadhramaut Mountains rise to the east, jagged peaks that catch the morning sun. The Red Sea lies somewhere beyond the western horizon, unseen but always there, affecting the climate, bringing slightly more moisture than the deep interior receives. The route follows ancient paths, tracks worn by thousands of previous caravans, marked by cairns and the bones of animals that did not survive the journey. The rhythm of the camel's gait becomes the rhythm of life. A swaying, loping walk. The men talk during the cooler morning hours. They tell stories. They argue. They plan. By midday, conversation stops. The heat is too much. The men wrap their faces in cloth, leaving only their eyes exposed. They endure. This is the nature of desert travel. Long stretches of endurance punctuated by brief respites. At an oasis, the routine changes. The caravan arrives in late afternoon. There is negotiation with the local sheikh. Payment is arranged. Water rights must be secured. The camels are unloaded and allowed to drink. They drink astonishing amounts, 10 to 20 gallons each, enough to sustain them for days. The men fill their water skins. Fresh water, cool from the well, tastes sweet after days of warm, stale water from skins. The oasis is a small settlement. Perhaps 50 people live here permanently. They farm dates, maintain the well, and provide services to passing caravans. Accommodation is basic, a communal tent or a structure of palm fronds. Meals are prepared, dates, which are the staple of the oasis. Bread baked in clay ovens. A stew of lentils or beans, perhaps with a bit of meat if a goat or sheep has been slaughtered. The food is simple but sufficient. The men rest. Some sleep. Others attend to gear, repairing saddles, checking loads. The caravan master meets with the sheikh, exchanging news. Who has passed through recently? Whether there have been raids. The condition of wells further along the route. This information is vital. A dry well can force a detour of days. A hostile tribe can require negotiation or tribute. At night, fires are built. Not large fires, fuel is scarce, but enough for cooking and warmth. The desert, which bakes during the day, becomes cold at night. Temperatures can drop 40 degrees between afternoon and midnight. The men wear layered clothing, stripping down during the day, bundling up at night. The stars emerge, bright beyond imagining in the absence of any competing light. The Milky Way is a glowing river across the sky. Constellations are navigation tools. The North Star, not directly overhead but visible, marks direction. Other stars rise and set at predictable times, marking the hours of the night. The men know these stars. They were taught them as children. The sky is a map and a clock, reliable and constant. Stories are told around the fire. Old stories, the deeds of ancestors, battles fought generations ago, heroes and villains, most forgotten except in these tellings. The stories serve multiple purposes. They pass time. They teach values. They bind the group together through shared culture. and they are entertainment, the only entertainment available in this place. Eventually, sleep comes. The men lie on blankets on the sand, close to the fire for warmth. A few stand watch, rotating through the night. Thieves are rare but not unknown. Wild animals, while less common in the desert than in wetter lands, exist. Hyenas, wolves. The guards listen more than watch. In the dark, sound carries far. Morning comes early. The caravan prepares to move before sunrise. The same routine: loading, checking, mounting. And then the slow march continues. This routine repeats for weeks, oasis to oasis. Sometimes the gap between water sources is only a day's travel, sometimes 3 days. 3 days is the practical limit for loaded camels in hot weather. Beyond that, the risk becomes unacceptable. The route is designed around this constraint. The location of wells determines where humans can travel. The caravan passes through territories of different tribes. Each requires some form of payment. Protection fees, they are called, though they are essentially tolls. A fixed amount paid to ensure safe passage. The alternative is raiding, which benefits no one. Raiders might take goods, but they might also be injured or killed. The caravan has guards. A fight is costly for both sides. Payment is simpler. The tribe gets revenue. The caravan gets safety. Everyone benefits. As the weeks pass, the landscape gradually changes. The mountains recede to the east. The land becomes more variable. Hills and wadis, rocky plains, occasional patches of vegetation where a seasonal stream once flowed. Signs of human presence become more frequent. Abandoned campsites, cairns marking graves, rock carvings, some ancient, depicting animals and humans in simplified forms. The caravan enters the northern territories, the Hijaz region, where oases are more common and the land is less harsh. Settlements grow larger. Yathrib is passed, a substantial oasis with agriculture and permanent buildings. The caravan does not stop there, not on this journey, but it is noted, a place of relative abundance. Further north still, and the land transitions again. The desert gives way gradually to steppe, more vegetation, the possibility of rain. The route turns slightly westward, toward the IE coast, toward Gaza. The final stretch is almost easy compared to what came before. Wells are more frequent. The climate is milder. The Mediterranean is near. Finally, Gaza. The caravan stops. The long journey is over. The city is large, bustling, cosmopolitan. Greek is spoken here alongside Aramaic and Arabic. Roman soldiers patrol the streets. The port handles ships from across the Mediterranean. This is where Arabia meets the wider world. The goods are unloaded. The frankincense and myrrh are sold to merchant houses, who will distribute them further, to Alexandria, to Rome, to Athens, to Damascus. The prices are negotiated, often predetermined by long-standing agreements between trading families. A pound of frankincense might sell for the equivalent of a laborer's monthly wages. The entire caravan load represents wealth that would be considered fortune in Marib. The caravan master takes his payment. He purchases goods to carry back. Olive oil, which Arabia does not produce in quantity. Wine for those who drink it. Glassware from Phoenician workshops, delicate and valuable. Weapons, iron swords, and spearheads, better than what Arabian smiths typically produce. Tools, fabrics, fine linens, and wools. These goods will be sold in southern Arabia, completing the trade cycle. And then the journey south begins again. Another 2 or 3 months. Another long walk through heat and dust. This is the rhythm of the incense trade. Endless cycles, goods flowing north, goods flowing south, wealth accumulating in the hands of those who control the routes, kingdoms rising on the profits. But that trade, by the 6th century, was declining. Sea routes had become more efficient. Ships could carry more cargo faster than camels. The Red Sea ports of Egypt handled an increasing share of trade with India and East Africa. The overland incense route through Arabia which had been the primary artery for over 1,000 years, was no longer essential. The wealth that had sustained the southern kingdoms began to dry up like the ancient rivers. The Marib Dam, the great symbol of Sabaean hydraulic engineering, finally collapsed. Traditions disagree on when exactly, but it was sometime in the 6th century. The dam had been maintained for over 1,000 years, repaired after every flood, every crack. But maintenance requires resources, organization, and stability. The Himyarite kingdom was weakening. Repair efforts failed. One year the floods came and the dam broke. Water that had irrigated the valley for generations poured out uncontrolled. Fields were destroyed. The population scattered. Some migrated north. Others moved to the highlands. The collapse of the Marib Dam entered Arabian memory as a symbol of the end of an age. Southern Arabia was fragmenting. The north was dominated by foreign-backed tribal confederations. The interior remained tribal, fragmented, and largely autonomous. The cities were small: Mecca, Yathrib, and a few others in the Hijaz. Taif, in the mountains, some coastal towns. But Arabia had no empire, no unifying state, no central power. It was a mosaic of tribes, oases, and sanctuaries. The religious landscape reflected that fragmentation. The old gods remained, but their authority felt less certain. Christianity and Judaism offered more universal visions, gods not bound to single tribes or single stones. Some Arabs converted, others remained polytheist but engaged with monotheistic ideas. There were Hanifs, individuals who rejected polytheism and sought a purer monotheism, though they followed neither Christianity nor Judaism. They wandered, they preached, they were respected but marginal. Into this world of shifting faiths and fading kingdoms, Muhammad was born around the year 570. His father died before his birth. His mother died when he was 6. He was raised by his grandfather, then by his uncle. The tribe, the Quraysh, provided structure. He grew up in Mecca, in the shadow of the Kaaba. He worked as a merchant. He traveled with caravans. He married a wealthy widow named Khadijah. He had children. He lived an ordinary life for 25 years. But at age 40, he began to experience visions, to hear a voice, to receive what he understood as revelation from God, delivered by the angel Gabriel. The revelations would continue for the rest of his life, and after his death, they would be compiled into the Quran. But in those early years, he shared the messages only with his family and close friends. Khadijah believed him. His cousin Ali believed him. A merchant named Abu Bakr believed him. The message was simple at first. There is one God. Worship him alone. The idols are false. The day of judgment is coming. Give charity. Treat the poor with justice. The orphan, the widow. These messages were not entirely foreign to Mecca. Jews and Christians had said similar things, but hearing it from one of their own, from a Qurayshi merchant, was different. It was a challenge to the social order, to the religious economy that depended on the Kaaba and its many gods. Muhammad began to preach publicly around the year 613. He gathered followers. The poor and marginalized were drawn to the message. Some younger members of powerful families converted, which caused tension. The Quraysh leadership opposed him, not initially through violence, but through social pressure, mockery, economic boycotts. They tried to protect the old ways, the pilgrimage, the trade, the gods that had served Mecca well enough. The opposition grew harsher. Some of Muhammad's followers were persecuted. Some were tortured. In 615, a group of Muslims emigrated to Aksum, seeking refuge with the Christian king there. Muhammad remained in Mecca, protected by his clan, but increasingly isolated. In 619, both his wife Khadijah and his uncle and protector Abu Talib died. The same year. It was called the Year of Sorrow. Without his uncle, Muhammad's protection within the tribe weakened. The opposition intensified. His life was in danger. He looked for allies elsewhere. He traveled to Taif, a town in the mountains southeast of Mecca, hoping to find support. He was rejected, mocked, driven out by crowds throwing stones. He returned to Mecca bloodied and despairing. Then came an invitation from Yathrib, the oasis to the north. Delegations from Yathrib had met Muhammad during the pilgrimage season in Mecca. They had heard his preaching. Some had converted. Yathrib was fractured by tribal feuds, particularly between the two main Arab tribes, Aws and Khazraj, and the Jewish clans. They saw in Muhammad someone who might mediate, someone neutral, someone with a message that might unite them. In 622, Muhammad and his followers made the Hijra, the emigration, from Mecca to Yathrib. They traveled in small groups to avoid attracting attention. Muhammad himself left last, secretly, with Abu Bakr. They hid in a cave outside Mecca for 3 days while search parties scoured the roads. Then they traveled north. They reached Yathrib in safety. The Hijra marks the beginning of the Islamic calendar. It is year 1, not because it was the beginning of revelation, but because it was the beginning of community, of the Ummah. In Yathrib, which became known as Medina, the city of the Prophet, Muhammad was not just a preacher. He was a leader, a judge, a political and military figure. The story from this point forward is no longer the story of ancient Arabia. It is the story of Islam's emergence, of battles, of treaties, of the return to Mecca, of the unification of the peninsula under a new faith. That story is vast and well known, and not the story being told tonight. Tonight is about the world that came before, the Arabia that existed for thousands of years before Islam, the gods who are no longer worshipped, the kingdoms that crumbled, the trade routes that shifted, the tribes that scattered, the stones that still stand in the desert, carved with scripts most cannot read. What do we know about the people who lived in that older Arabia? Not the kings, whose names survived in inscriptions, but the common people, the farmers, the herders, the merchants, the women. Women in pre-Islamic Arabia held varied status depending on tribe and region. Among some Bedouin tribes, women could own property, inherit wealth, and divorce. Among others, their status was lower. Female infanticide occurred, particularly during famines, a practice that Islam would later condemn. But women also held religious roles. Priestesses served at shrines. Women poets composed and performed. Khadijah, Muhammad's first wife, was a successful merchant who employed men. The historical record is uneven, but it suggests diversity, not uniformity. Daily life in an oasis town would have revolved around water, the irrigation schedule, the dates ripening, the palm groves that provided food, shade, and material for building. Houses were simple, built of mud brick or stone, roofs of palm fronds, small windows, courtyards where families gathered. Meals were communal, bread baked in clay ovens, dates and dried fruit, milk from goats, meat on special occasions. Markets were the center of social life. Merchants displayed goods on blankets or in stalls. Metalwork, textiles, spices, leather. People bargained. News was exchanged. Poets performed for coins or meals. Storytellers recounted the deeds of ancient heroes. The market was also where disputes were settled, where tribal representatives met, where reputations were made or lost. In the desert, Bedouin life followed different patterns. The tribe moved with the seasons, seeking pasture for the herds. Tents were raised and struck. Distances that seem impossible were covered on camelback. Children learned to ride before they could walk far. Women managed the household, which meant managing the tent, the food, the water supply. Men herded and hunted and raided. Elders made decisions by consensus. Honor was everything. A slight against one was a slight against all. Poetry competitions were held at seasonal fairs. The most famous was the Ukaz fair, held annually near Mecca. Tribes gathered to trade, to settle disputes, and to hear poets. The best poems were praised and memorized. Some were written down on leather or papyrus. 7 of these odes, the Mu'allaqat, were later said to have been hung on the Kaaba itself though this tradition is debated. Whether they hung or not, they were treasured. They captured the voice of pre-Islamic Arabia, the ethos, the landscape, the values. One of these poets was Imru al-Qais, a prince who lost his kingdom and wandered the desert seeking revenge, never achieving it, dying in exile. His poetry is vivid with longing and loss. Another was Zuhair ibn Abi Sulma, a poet of peace who praised reconciliation between tribes. His ode celebrates a mediation that ended a long and bloody feud. These poems are still read, still taught. They preserve a voice that would have otherwise vanished. The gods of that era are mostly gone, their names preserved, but their worship ended. Hubal, who stood in the Kaaba, represented by a carnelian idol. He was imported from Nabataean, a god of divination. Al-Lat, whose temple stood in Taif, where sacrifices were made and oaths sworn. Al-Uzza, who had a shrine in a sacred valley where a stone and a tree were her symbols. Manat, whose idol stood on the coast, associated with fate and fortune. The rituals are harder to reconstruct. We know there were pilgrimages, not just to Mecca, but to many shrines. Sacred months when warfare ceased and pilgrims traveled safely. Rituals involved circumambulation, walking in circles around the shrine. Animal sacrifice, the blood poured on stones. Offerings of incense, dates, barley. Vows made and fulfilled. Prayers spoken, though we do not know the words. Some gods were celestial, the sun, the moon, Venus, the stars that guided travel and marked seasons. Other gods were tied to specific places, a particular mountain, a spring, a tree. The divine was immanent, present in the landscape itself. The afterlife was uncertain in pre-Islamic Arabian belief. There are inscriptions that suggest some believed in continuation after death. Others seem to have believed this life was all there was. Poetry often reflects a stoic acceptance of mortality. Life is brief. Fame and honor outlast the body. Death comes to all. This was not a nihilistic worldview, but a grounded one. The desert teaches humility. Water can vanish. The strong can fall. The wealthy can lose everything in a single raid. Life was precarious. The tribe provided continuity. Children carried names forward. Poets carried memory. That was the immortality most hoped for. By the late 6th century, Arabia was ready for change in ways its people may not have fully understood. The old kingdoms were gone or weakened. The tribal system, stable for centuries, was under pressure from larger empires. The trade routes were shifting. The religious landscape was fragmenting. People were searching for meaning, for unity, for something that could organize life beyond the tribe. Islam provided that. But Islam did not erase what came before. It built on it. The Arabic language, the poetry, the tribal structures that became the basis for early Islamic armies and administration. The pilgrimage to Mecca, reframed but continuous. Even the Kaaba, stripped of idols, remained the sacred center. The transformation was rapid but not total. Not every Arab converted immediately. Some tribes resisted for years. After Muhammad's death in 632, parts of Arabia rebelled in what is called the Ridda Wars, the Wars of Apostasy. The new state, based in Medina, fought to hold the peninsula together. They succeeded. Within a decade, Arab armies were pushing beyond Arabia into Syria, Mesopotamia, Persia, Egypt, the conquests that built an empire. But the Arabia that launched those conquests was not a blank slate. It carried forward thousands of years of history, skills honed over centuries, knowledge of desert navigation, tribal loyalties that became military units, poetic traditions that shaped early Islamic literature, commercial networks that became the framework for a vast trade empire. The incense kingdoms left ruins, temples in the Yemeni highlands, the dam at Marib broken but still visible, inscriptions in old scripts. Petra still stands, its facades glowing in the sun. Mada in Salih, The Nabataean city south of Petra lies silent, its tombs carved into cliffs, empty for centuries. Archaeologists continue to uncover evidence of that older Arabia. Pottery shards, coins, graves. Entire cities buried under sand. Each find adds detail to the picture. Trade connections with India, with East Africa, with Central Asia. Evidence of cultural exchange, of adaptation and innovation. In the interior there are rock carvings, petroglyphs of camels, ibexes, hunters, scripts scratched into stone by travelers. Some are thousands of years old. They mark presence. They say, "I was here. We passed this way. Remember us. Those who carved them are forgotten. Their names are lost. Their tribes may have vanished or merged with others. But the carvings remain. Evidence of human life in one of the least forgiving places on earth." The Rub al-Khali, the empty quarter, still exists. It is still one of the driest places on the planet. Temperatures reach extremes. In summer, the sand is too hot to touch. In winter, nights are freezing. Water is almost non-existent. Yet even there, Bedouin travel. Even there, humans have found ways to live, to cross, to survive. This resilience is part of Arabia's story. The ability to endure, to adapt, to find water where none seems possible, to navigate by stars, to maintain honor in a world without centralized law. These are not primitive traits. They are sophisticated responses to a harsh environment. The camel, again, deserves mention, the animal that made it all possible. Domesticated sometime between 3000 and 2000 before the Common Era, probably in southern Arabia or the Horn of Africa. The camel can go for weeks without water by storing fat in its hump and minimizing water loss. It can eat thorny plants that other animals cannot. It can carry heavy loads. It provides milk richer than cow's milk, sustaining families in the desert. Its dung, dried, provides fuel for fires. Its hide makes leather. Its hair is woven into tents and rope. Without camels, the Bedouin way of life would be impossible. Without camels, the incense trade could not have functioned on the scale it did. The camel is woven into Arabian identity as deeply as the horse is into steppe cultures or the ship into seafaring peoples. Horses existed in Arabia, but they were rare and valuable. They were bred for raiding and warfare, prized for speed. Arabian horses became legendary. They were smaller than European breeds, but faster and more enduring. Later, these horses would carry Arab armies into Persia and beyond. But in the pre-Islamic period, they were luxury items, owned by the wealthy, cared for meticulously. A good horse could be worth dozens of camels. Falconry was practiced, hunting with falcons and hawks. The birds were trapped, trained, and used to hunt smaller game. It was a skill that required patience and deep knowledge of the birds. A trained falcon was valuable and respected. This tradition continues in Arabia to this day. Music existed, though little of it survived in written form. Instruments included the oud, a stringed instrument ancestor to the lute, drums, flutes. Singing was common, work songs, lullabies, songs of longing and love. Music accompanied poetry. It marked celebrations and mourning. Weddings were significant events. They involved negotiation between families. A bride price was paid. Celebrations could last days, feasting, music, poetry. The bride was veiled and brought to her new home in procession. Marriage created alliances between tribes. It was political as much as personal. Death was marked by mourning rituals. Women would wail and tear their garments. The body was washed and wrapped in cloth. Burial was simple, a grave in the earth, sometimes marked by stones. Wealthy individuals might have more elaborate tombs, but most burials were modest. Mourning lasted days. Visitors came to offer condolences. Stories of the deceased were told. Their deeds remembered. Warfare between tribes was common, but not constant. Raids were frequent, but large-scale battles were rarer. Most conflicts were over resources, water, pasture, grazing rights. Or they were feuds, cycles of revenge that could last generations. A killing demanded retaliation. That retaliation demanded counter-retaliation. Some feuds became legendary, lasting decades, consuming whole tribes in enmity. One such feud was the War of Bassus, sparked by the killing of a camel belonging to an old woman named Basis. The camel strayed onto protected land. It was killed. Basis's nephew sought revenge. He killed the protector of the land. This sparked a war between two tribal confederations that lasted 40 years. Hundreds died. The war became proverbial for pointless, destructive feuding. Peace was finally made through the mediation of a poet, Zuhair ibn Abi Sulma, whose ode celebrating the peace is one of the Mu'allaqat. Justice in tribal Arabia was maintained through customary law, not written codes. Elders judged disputes. Restitution was preferred over punishment. Blood money, diya, could be paid to the family of a slain person to avoid a cycle of revenge. The amounts were negotiated. A life had a price, and paying it could restore peace. This system was not perfect, but it functioned without any central enforcement. It relied on reputation, on the knowledge that a tribe that refused to honor agreements would be ostracized, unable to trade, to marry, to survive. Slavery existed in pre-Islamic Arabia. Captives from raids or wars could be enslaved. Slaves were bought and sold in markets. They worked as servants, herders, or laborers. Their status varied. Some were treated well, integrated into households, even freed. Others faced harsh treatment. Islam would later regulate slavery, encouraging manumission, but it did not abolish it. And the slavery that existed in Arabia was not the racialized chattel slavery of later eras. It was based on capture and circumstance, not ethnicity. Trade was not only in incense. Arabia exported horses, leather goods, and textiles. It imported grain, wine, olive oil, weapons, and luxury goods. The ports of southern Arabia traded with India and East Africa, ivory, spices, silk. These goods passed through Arabia on their way to Rome and Persia. The peninsula was a crossroads, a bridge between worlds. The southern ports, places like Aden and Qana, were cosmopolitan. Merchants from many lands, languages mixed, cultures blended. It is easy to imagine docks crowded with ships, warehouses filled with goods, sailors speaking Greek, Aramaic, Arabic, Tamil. The smell of spices, the sound of haggling, the movement of wealth across oceans and deserts. In the highlands of Yemen, agriculture supported larger populations. Terraced fields climbed the mountainsides. Sorghum and wheat were grown. Coffee, which would become so important, had not yet arrived, but other crops thrived. The highlands caught the monsoon rains. Water was more reliable. Towns were larger. Buildings were taller, sometimes several stories, built of stone with intricate geometric decoration. Yemeni architecture, even today, retains echoes of that ancient style. The Himyarites, in their final centuries, built castles and fortresses. Gumdan Palace in Sana'a was said to be one of the most magnificent buildings in Arabia, a multi-story structure with bronze lions on its corners that roared when the wind blew. It was destroyed in the 7th century. Nothing remains but descriptions in later texts. Whether those descriptions are accurate or embellished is unknown. Religion in southern Arabia was distinct from the north. The gods were different, though there was overlap. The moon god, Al-Makka, was central to Sabaean religion. Temples to Al-Makka have been excavated, revealing altars, inscriptions, and ritual objects. Animal sacrifice was common. Incense was burned constantly. The temples were not just religious centers, but economic ones, owning land, managing wealth, and employing priests and laborers. The transition from polytheism to monotheism in southern Arabia was gradual and complex. Jewish communities existed, particularly in Himyar. Christian communities grew in Najran and other regions. The royal court of Himyar adopted Judaism at some point in the late 5th century, though the population remained largely polytheist. The Aksumite invasion brought Christianity to power, but it did not convert everyone. By the time Islam arrived in the 630s, southern Arabia was religiously diverse and politically fragmented. The interior of Arabia, the Najd, remained more conservative. The tribes there held to traditional beliefs longer. They were more isolated, less touched by the religious currents flowing from the empires to the north. When Islam came, some tribes in the Najd resisted. Others converted quickly. It depended on local leaders, on circumstances, on opportunities. The Ghassanids, the Christian Arab kingdom allied with Byzantium, represented one end of the spectrum, fully integrated into the Byzantine world. Christian, literate, building churches, hosting theological debates. The Ghassanid kings met with Byzantine emperors. They fought in Byzantine armies. They were Arab by culture, but Roman by political allegiance. The Lakhmids, allied with Persia, were similar but oriented eastward. Their capital, Hira, was a center of learning. Christian scholars translated Greek texts into Syriac and Arabic. Poets gathered at the Lakhmid court. The king of the Lakhmids was a patron of the arts. This cultural flourishing in the borderlands influenced the interior. Ideas spread. Poetry styles evolved. The Arabic language itself was enriched by contact with Syriac, Aramaic, and Persian. The script used to write Arabic evolved during this period. The earliest Arabic inscriptions are in scripts derived from Nabataean Aramaic. The letters were angular, still closely tied to their Aramaic roots. Over centuries, the script became more fluid, more distinct. By the time of Muhammad, Arabic could be written, though literacy was not common. Most people relied on oral transmission. Memory was the primary archive. The Quran itself was initially preserved in memory. Muhammad's followers memorized the revelations as they were delivered. After his death, there was an effort to compile them into a written text. This compilation produced the Quran as it exists now, a book in Arabic believed by Muslims to be the literal word of God. But the transition from oral to written was part of a longer process, one that began in pre-Islamic Arabia. The relationship between Arabs and their land is central to understanding that older world. The desert was not seen as empty or hostile, though it was harsh. It was home. It had beauty, the silence, the vastness, the clarity of stars, the brief blooming of flowers after rain. Poetry is full of images of abandoned campsites, traces of where a tribe had been. The tent circles faded in the sand. The cold hearth. These images carried emotional weight. They spoke of impermanence, of longing, of memory. The desert was also a space of freedom. No kings ruled there, no walls enclosed it. A man could disappear into the desert and not be found. A tribe could move beyond the reach of any authority. This autonomy was prized. It is part of why the Arabian interior resisted centralization for so long. The tribes did not want to be governed. They wanted to govern themselves. That independence had costs. Without central authority, disputes could escalate. Without infrastructure, droughts could devastate. The tribal system was stable, but it was also fragile. It worked in a context of low population density and limited resources. It could not easily scale. When Islam unified the tribes, it had to create new structures to hold them together. The caliphate, the army, the shared mission of spreading the faith. But before that unification, Arabia was many worlds. The world of the Bedouin, the world of the oasis, the world of the trading cities, the world of the southern kingdoms. They overlapped. They interacted, but they were distinct. A Bedouin from the Najd and a merchant from Petra lived very different lives, though both were Arabs. Language unified them. Arabic, in its many dialects, was spoken across the peninsula. Mutual intelligibility varied, but communication was possible. The language carried culture, proverbs, poetry, stories. The language itself was a repository of knowledge: how to find water, how to read the weather, how to navigate, the vocabulary of survival. The landscape shaped the language. There are dozens of words in Arabic for different types of camels, different types of sand, different types of wind. This specificity reflects the importance of these things. In a desert, knowing the difference between types of sand can mean life or death. Soft sand that swallows, hard sand that holds. Knowing the wind that brings rain versus the wind that brings dust. This is not poetic flourish. It is precision born of necessity. Time was measured differently, not by clocks or calendars as we know them. The lunar calendar marked months, the phases of the moon. The year was shorter than the solar year, so seasons drifted. Sacred months were recognized across tribes: Rajab, Dhu al-Qida, Dhu al-Hijjah, Muharram. During these months, raiding ceased. Pilgrims traveled. Fairs were held. These were times of truce, necessary for economic and religious life. The stars were the clock of the night. Constellations marked the hours. The Bedouin knew the sky intimately. Navigation depended on it. There are stars that rise before dawn at certain times of year, marking the seasons for planting or migration. The Pleiades, Orion, Sirius. These were not just points of light, but markers of time and space. The natural world was observed closely, which plants indicated water below the surface, which insects appeared before rain. The behavior of animals. A camel lifting its head to smell the air might sense distant water. A particular bird might signal a nearby oasis. This knowledge was accumulated over generations and passed down through teaching and imitation. Children learned by doing. A boy learned to handle camels by watching his father, then by helping, then by doing. A girl learned weaving, food preparation, and tent management the same way. Formal education, in the sense of schools, did not exist in the desert. Knowledge was practical and oral. Stories taught lessons. Proverbs condensed wisdom. An elder's experience was invaluable. Healers existed, usually women, who knew herbs and remedies. Which plants could reduce fever, which could treat wounds, how to set a broken bone, how to assist in childbirth. This medical knowledge was pragmatic, accumulated through trial and error. Some remedies worked, some did not. But in the absence of doctors, these healers were essential. Religion and healing sometimes overlapped. Amulets were worn for protection. Prayers were said over the sick. Certain shrines were believed to offer cures. Whether through divine intervention or the placebo effect, people believed these practices helped. Belief itself was a form of medicine. The pre-Islamic Arabs were not without philosophy. Poetry often grappled with big questions: the meaning of life, the nature of fate, the value of honor versus survival. These were not academic debates, but lived questions. A poet like Tarafa ibn al-Abd, who died young, wrote about living fully because life is short. His poetry is existential in tone. He saw no afterlife to hope for, so he celebrated the pleasures of this life: wine, love, bravery. This was one response to the harshness of existence. Other poets took different views. Some emphasized duty and honor over pleasure. Some praised endurance and patience. The tribal context shaped these values. A tribe that valued recklessness would not survive. A tribe that valued only caution would be vulnerable. The balance between courage and prudence was a constant negotiation. War, when it came, was brutal but limited. Battles were fought on foot and horseback. Swords, spears, bows. Armor was rare, a luxury. Most warriors fought in simple garments. Battles were often decided quickly. A charge, a clash. One side would break and flee. Pursuit was dangerous. The desert offered no cover, but it also offered escape. A fleeing warrior could vanish into vastness. The famous Battle of Dukar, fought around the year 610, pitted Arab tribes against a Persian army. The Persians had backed the Lakhmids, but the Lakhmids had fallen out of favor. The Persian king sent an army to punish rebellious Arab tribes. The tribes united and defeated the Persians decisively. The battle became legendary. It was remembered as a moment when Arabs proved they could stand against an empire. It fed into later Arab identity, a story of independence and martial prowess. But such large battles were rare. Most violence was smaller scale, raids, skirmishes, personal vendettas. The goal was usually not annihilation, but deterrence and reputation. A tribe that raided successfully gained prestige. A tribe that defended its herds and honor gained respect. The system was competitive, but not genocidal. Trade required peace, and peace required agreements. Tribes negotiated alliances. Marriages sealed agreements. A daughter married into another tribe created bonds. Children of such marriages had ties to both tribes. Over time, this web of kinship connected many tribes, creating a broader Arabian identity even without political unity. The fairs, like Hijaz, were neutral ground, a kind of international space where tribal conflicts were suspended. Merchants came from across Arabia and beyond. Poets competed. Judges arbitrated disputes. It was here that Arabic language and culture were refined. The best poets influenced how others spoke and wrote. The prestige dialect associated with the Quraysh and Central Arabia became the standard. This is the dialect in which the Quran would later be revealed, ensuring its spread across the peninsula. By the early 7th century, Arabia was on the cusp of transformation. The old structures were weakening, but had not yet collapsed. The Sasanian and Byzantine empires were exhausted from decades of war. The southern kingdoms had fragmented. The trade routes were shifting. The religious landscape was unstable. People were searching for meaning, for unity, for something new. Muhammad's message offered that: a single God, a clear moral code, a community that transcended tribe, a vision that extended beyond Arabia. But the foundation for that vision was built by the centuries that came before. The tribal structures that became military units, the poetic tradition that shaped the Quran's style, the trade networks that became the infrastructure of an empire, the resilience and adaptability of a people who had survived in one of Earth's harshest environments. Ancient Arabia, the Arabia before Islam, was not a prelude to something greater. It was a civilization in its own right. Complex, diverse, adaptive. It produced art and architecture that still moves people today. Poetry that is still read. Systems of law and honor that governed millions. Trade networks that connected continents. And a people who knew how to endure. The stones still stand in the desert. The ruins of Petra. The tombs of Nabataean Saleh. The remains of the Marib Dam. The inscriptions carved into cliffs. They are silent now. The gods they honored are no longer worshipped. The languages they were written in are no longer spoken. But they remain, evidence of a world that existed long before the stories most people know. And in those stones, in those ruins, there is a quiet dignity. They do not demand attention. They do not shout. They simply stand. Witnesses to a time when Arabia walked a different path, when the stars guided travelers toward different gods, when the desert was home to kingdoms and tribes whose names are mostly forgotten. This is not a story of progress or decline. It is not a story of savagery giving way to civilization. It is a story of change, of one world becoming another. The people who lived in ancient Arabia were no less human than those who came after. They loved, they mourned, they created, they endured, they built what they could with what they had. And when their world changed, some of what they built survived, transformed, carried forward into the new age. The night sky over Arabia looks much the same as it did 3,000 years ago. The stars in their courses, the moon waxing and waning, the silence of the desert. A traveler standing under that sky today would see what ancient travelers saw: the vastness, the clarity, the smallness of human presence against the scale of the land. But they would not hear the songs those ancient travelers sang. They would not know the prayers spoken to gods no longer remembered. They would not taste the water drawn from wells now buried under sand. That world is gone. It lives only in fragments, in ruins, in texts, in memory. And yet it shaped the world that followed. The Arabic language, the tribal values transformed into Islamic ethics. The